Hand traps have always been a huge topic in Yu-Gi-Oh! When some players saying that they should all be banned, to other players saying that they don't do enough. In today's video, we're going to be talking about another huge problem that has arisen in the card game surrounding hand traps and what you can do to be able to help the situation. Let's go ahead and jump on in. So big dog, this video was actually inspired by all of the comments that I've been getting, but also Joshua Smith made a video talking about hand traps potentially being problematic. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of the points that he has to say.
Not the most common response, but definitely a popular response under my deck profile for this deck and also other deck profiles for this deck has been the sentiment that, oh my god, what has Yu-Gi-Oh become that people are playing 23 hand traps in a 42 card deck, like over 50% of your deck is hand traps. I can't believe what Yu-Gi-Oh has become, that sort of stuff, right? To an extent, I think it's a valid thing to say. About this deck, I don't feel this way because from my perspective, playing this deck is actually fun. The concept of this deck is to just have better control over these decks in the format that try to like explode and make a board that you literally cannot beat anymore, like Snake Eyes and Yubel. You're trying to stop those decks from doing those super unfair things, and you're actually trying to force them into a grind game, which just so happens to be something that I personally enjoy. I enjoy the games that happen after you interrupt Snake Eye once or twice, or maybe even 3 times, and they still end up with like some sort of half board or charmer line or something like that, and you actually have to play a game of Yu-Gi-Oh against them.
Now keep in mind, Joshua's take is from ultra competitive players, and as a person that's played in those particular spaces, they think a lot differently than the average Yu-Gi-Oh player. Let's keep it a beam, guys. It almost doesn't matter what format that they're in, they're going to compete and they're going to find joy into it. Why? Because competition is what they live for. That's not always what we as Yu-Gi-Oh players in general feel about the game. We do feel the impact of playing 23 hand traps against a particular Yu-Gi-Oh deck. He did mention that it does help you beat some of the stronger decks in the format, but when you're playing this deck against a strategy that's not one of the stronger decks in the format, it starts to feel really bad. One of the biggest reasons why these strategies can exist is because of one-card combos. Seeing that most competitive Yu-Gi-Oh decks need just one card to be able to perform their entire function, and those particular one-card combos typically have 12 to 15 ways to be able to get to the deck, you can decrease the engine size of your Yu-Gi-Oh strategy and play a mesh of other cards to be able to disrupt your opponent. I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing, but when you can have access to so many great hand traps, it becomes extremely debilitating against the Yu-Gi-Oh strategies that don't have one-card combos. The problem isn't one card necessarily, it's that there are multiple possible one cards in any specific deck. I think you have a point there. Anytime in Yu-Gi-Oh where it's starting to see more and more, where you can have particular situations of this one card and then 12 other ways to get into that one card, it can become incredibly problematic because oftentimes those other ways to get into that one card is also a way to get into another card into the game. Meaning that if your opponent even stops your one card combo, trading one card in their hand to stop your one card, you just use another card to continue to do all of the busted things. And since those hand traps typically don't get rid of the card that it initially stopped, then you're in trouble. It's almost like you're losing a card just to stop an effect, but your opponent still has the monster that has more effects to it. Me personally, I liked it better when Konami forced these 2-card combo situations. Take for example, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, Blackwings require 2-card combos. Because of this, when you play a Blackwing deck, you have to increase your deck size to compensate for these 2-card combos. And because when you increase your deck size, you have to decrease the amount of non-engine that you can play, giving more of a balance to the game when it comes to being able to set up your board and disrupt your opponent. In no way do I think that one-card combos are the worst thing to happen in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think the problem with one-card combos is that the one card does so much. Yu-Gi-Oh! In 5 to 10 years will evolve to 0-card combos, just watch. Yu-Gi-Oh's in a really interesting situation where they have to keep up with power creep, so they have to continue to make one-card combo decks. And on top of that, those one-card combo decks are going to do so much. So we're going to start to experience more of these situations where players are playing these counter strategies with a ton of hand traps to be able to slow down these big one-card combo decks. And I think that that's the bigger problem with hand traps than hand traps themselves. But that doesn't mean that hand traps aren't a problem in themselves. I think Yu-Gi-Oh players don't want to be hand trapped in every single move that they make, which is fair. But the problem here is that most hand traps in the game seem to counter every single thing you do. Generic monsters like Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, Infinite Impermanence are played in just about every single Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and saying that they can blanket hit most Yu-Gi-Oh strategies, it's a problem. Especially if your strategy isn't strong enough to be able to compete with the newer Yu-Gi-Oh decks that are coming out with. You know, there is a one-card combo Yu-Gi-Oh deck that I think is incredibly balanced. Red Dragon Archfiend is the best one-card combo Yu-Gi-Oh deck in the game. It is a legitimate model of power, restrictions, and consistency, because Red Dragon Archfiend does have those 12 to 15 ways to get into full combo, but Red Dragon Archfiend has the restrictions, like legit restrictions, guys. Imagine if Snake Eyes Ash had the same restrictions of Red Dragon Archfiend. It would be balanced. So there's different tiers to what Konami is doing with these one card combo style Yu-Gi-Oh decks, and they could actually hit a pivot point to where these cards can still one card combo, but they require you to play a little bit more to be able to master them. Or they have the restrictions in place to reward good deck building and not just play these one card combos in combination with 23 hand traps. Called by is also a direct answer to hand traps. I disagree. I think that Called by the Grave doesn't solve the problem, it just makes the problem murkier. Let's take, for example, if you are playing a deck that requires 2 and 3 card combos, you're going to need 2 and 3 cards in hand. Where if your opponent is playing a 1 card combo deck, they require 1 card. So when they Call by the Grave you, while you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh trying to stop them, it means that you have 1 less card in hand and cards that don't interact your opponent. As opposed to when they hand trap you and you have Call by the Grave, they can actually survive by just activating more hand traps. I promise you guys, Call by the Grave is not going to make the situation better. I wouldn't say that it made it worse. Actually, it probably makes it worse. So there are some things that Konami can do to fix this problem, and then there's some things that you can do to fix this problem too. I think decks being able to have 23 hand traps inside of their strategy is actually a good thing. If there's anything that I've noticed about Yu-Gi-Oh, we get to a point of critical mass where things start to get really, really bad. And then, hopefully, Konami starts to print cards to fix their problem. Sometimes they do overcorrect, but sometimes they get it right. It was by design for 1 card combos to be really good. It was also by design for us to get more hand traps. In the last 6 months, we've gotten 4 new hand traps. Dominance, Purge, and Impulse being able to negate special summons and negate searches at the cost of not being able to use certain attributes, and then the Molcharmy cards in Walrus and Perillium. It is no mistake, since before then, the last hand trap that we got, I believe, is Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill. The reason why I think that is because hand traps actually suck against trap cards. When you're playing one of these mid-rangey slash decks to be able to beat huge combo decks, those strategies tend to lose against decks that can bypass the hand traps and place other cards instead, which is normally trap cards. You already know that decks like Labyrinth and Malice are pretty good against hand traps. I think the preventative measure to this particular format isn't to necessarily hit hand traps, but to continue making strategies that are good against those particular decks, but weaker to combo decks. But that could also just be me coping. There's also some things that Konami could do to be able to fix the situation themselves. I think limiting some of the more broad hand traps is important, like limiting Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence, the most generic ones, forcing players to think what particular hand traps that they can use inside of their deck to be able to counter some of the best. But if you do that, you're also going to have to limit the ceiling of some of the bigger combo Yu-Gi-Oh decks. So what exactly can we do in this Yu-Gi-Oh format? I think that when we build Yu-Gi-Oh decks, we're going to have to be a lot smarter with what we're playing against. Fortunately enough, these type of Yu-Gi-Oh strategies bring out the best when it comes to players, allowing players to be able to pick decks that can counter these type of hand trap situations. Like this Kashtira Fiendsmith deck that's running around is really, really weak to traps. One thing that we can all agree to is that players are playing a ton of hand traps and decks are starting to feel like hand trap soup. But since we're moving towards that critical mass, I think that players will start playing those decks a lot less, because a counter will then come alongside, and then that will help balance what things are going on right now. That alongside of the ban list. With the ban list looming around too, it really does feel like a Yu-Gi-Oh phase. But let me know what you guys think about this current format and where you stand with hand traps. Me personally, I don't think it's going to be like this very much longer. I feel like the different amount of hand traps depends on the type of deck, no? Like what Josh said, people have built these super hand trap decks to counter the combo decks. The next step of evolution would be what beats these super hand trap decks. And I'm going for the trap-based Yu-Gi-Oh decks. And as you guys already know, triangles are the most powerful structures, and that creates a triangle where you have one deck beats the other, which loses to one, which beats the first deck. Yes, Shifter beats the majority of decks, but not all decks can afford to run Shifter. Mctastic, I actually don't think that's true. I think you're going to witness a triangle format with Shifter too, which is going to balance itself out. You see, Shifter is good against the current Yu-Gi-Oh decks that we're playing, but then players will stop playing the current Yu-Gi-Oh decks that we're playing because of Shifter. And because of that, Shifter will be bad, which makes the other decks that are graveyard reliant good again. Konami has done this time after time before. They make triangles, man. Triangles, I'm telling you, triangles fix everything.